Welcome back to the Stratcom podcast. Today, we're very fortunate to have Graham Brookie with us. Graham is the Vice President for Strategy and Tech Programs and Senior Director of the DFRLab at Atlantic Council. And he is a well-known national security and information expert with a decade of experience leading interdisciplinary teams. Graham, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be back.
Good. So maybe first about DFRLab. I imagine you have a lot of work on your hands, particularly since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Could you maybe talk about how that has shifted your priorities or some of the main questions you're looking at?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and it's fascinating for this podcast specifically because the last time I was on this podcast, it was a couple of days into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The last time I was on this podcast was February 2022. And so at that point, we were talking about exactly kind of what we were seeing in real time and figuring out what our strategy for understanding what Russia's malign influence strategy or information operation strategy would look like in addition to their full-scale military operations. Now, for us at the DFR Lab is now 36 researchers spread out across 17 different countries on 4 different continents. But Russia's activity towards Ukraine is very much in the origin story of DFRLab. The very first report that the DFR ever wrote, published in 2016, was open source analysis of Russian military operations in eastern Ukraine. And at that point, the open source analysis was very, very simple. We were looking at selfies literally being posted up and down the contact line by Russian regulars. And we were able to prove at a time when Russia said, we don't have any official military in eastern Ukraine. We were able to prove that they were under the command and control. They were, in fact, Russian regulars. And that's been an effort that we've continued. That research has continued at the DFR Lab since then. So for 7 years, over 7 years at this point, we've been looking at Ukraine and Russia's activity against Ukraine. How that work has changed since February 2022 has been very interesting. We've ramped up conflict monitoring. We have looked at a lot of the false narratives, and especially the false narratives that create the predicate for war or create the reason that Putin justified this war of aggression, which is comprehensive. It's consistent and remains narratives that we're looking at. But we've also done a lot of open source analysis of Russian war crimes or Russian military activity up and down the contact line. And so we've tried to adapt that for the scale of this military operation, which is greater than anything that we've seen even in 2014, 2015, that original kind of conflict or backing of separatist movements in eastern Ukraine. What we have seen categorically is, at first, it was a little bit slow. The information operations strategy was a little bit lagged behind. It turns out their military operation has gone on for a lot longer than what they had planned for 3 days in Ukraine. And so as it has prolonged, we've seen a more concerted strategy across the information environment from Russia. And a lot of that work a lot of our work in monitoring has focused on platforms that are emerging, have more users, have been not necessarily the focus of our research in past years, platforms like Telegram and TikTok in particular. And so we have a number of findings on those platforms that are particularly interesting. One of the challenges for us is that where we've adjusted research for what Russia is communicating to its own public, including strategic disinformation as a cause for war, what Russia is doing in the actual conflict zone, eastern Ukraine and towards Ukraine, what Russia is doing in the near region, former Soviet states or frontline states in NATO in particular, and then what Russia is doing globally. And the narratives that they use in each one of those kind of categories are very similar, but slightly different riffs on each narrative. And so it's important to understand what their holistic strategy is, because Ukraine is their narratives about Ukraine is one of their main focuses for information operations globally. And so we've scaled up that, and I would expect us to continue even as the kind of global public attention wanes on Ukraine, and it's our responsibility to expose what Russia is doing about Ukraine all over the world.
So we've seen that Russia, despite suffering, colossal losses in the battlefield, some reports saying, up to 500,000 in casualties. Nevertheless, we do see that they are able to learn, of course, and adapt, adapt their strategies and tactics accordingly. Are you seeing any of the same dynamic in the information domain, that Russians have somehow, adjusted their methods or disinformation narratives over this 2-year period?
Certainly. I mean, I'll use Telegram as an example. The Digital Forensic Research Lab is about to publish a comprehensive report that's looking at Telegram and the role of Telegram in information conflict in Ukraine right now. And where we've seen a lot of change in Russia's strategy, I'd say change because the tactics are somewhat new, but the narratives remain the same at heart. And so Telegram being a point-to-point communications platform where you have some amount of broadcast capability, which is something that we have to explain to folks in the United States. Telegram has over 800 million users around the world, and only 2% of those users are based in the United States. And so it's one of the platforms that's very, very globally prominent, especially in and around Russia and Ukraine, Central and Eastern Europe as well, and increasingly in places in Asia and Africa. And so it's this rapidly growing platform. And because of its design, it's designed for you and I to be able to send text messages to each other. It's also designed for, if I am an influencer, I can have a very large broadcast channel, which similar platforms have limited the reach of broadcast functionality. Like, for instance, on WhatsApp, I can't broadcast as large as I can or to as many people as you can on Telegram because they were concerned about virality. And Telegram is notoriously kind of laissez-faire about what can happen on platform. They don't have a trust and safety team that is very concerned about whether state actors are running malicious influence operations or whether non-state actors like Hamas are using that platform. And so what we've seen from Russia on Telegram in particular, we monitored something like 500,000 unique posts on Telegram throughout a monitoring period. And we've seen, number one, increased engagement across that platform, in particular from the full scale of what Russia would incorporate into its state-backed influence operations. So state media has a large presence there. A lot of the, not technical term, but the mill blog ecosystem. There's a very vibrant culture of military bloggers that kind of track what various entities across the military and intelligence ecosystem from Russia are doing. And they post about it regularly, so you can kind of read the tea leaves on what they're thinking at any given moment. And then very, very targeted local information operations using Telegram, because people up and down the contact line in eastern Ukraine and all over Ukraine are using Telegram specifically to figure out what's going on in their neighborhoods. And so we've seen sustained local efforts from Russia to influence things that are happening on the ground in real time. So that's a basic summary, but I would say that expecting Russian information operations is kind of like expecting that weather will change at some point. It's going to constantly change. But the narratives that we're seeing are fairly similar, where they had a slow start on information operations at the beginning of this military campaign. We've seen them ramp up. We've seen them catch up with regard to tactics. And I would expect that to move forward at pace.
But so how has Telegram escaped the same scrutiny that these other social media platforms have gotten? Because, Meta or X, formerly Twitter, they are constantly criticized, right, and torn to shreds, in many cases, I think rightfully so, for their inadequate, failure to deal with these rampant disinformation on their platforms. How has Telegram been allowed to just kind of fly under the radar?
Well, I think one perhaps controversial take here is that Telegram isn't headquartered in the United States. A lot of the regulatory ecosystems at those larger social media platforms, because Telegram, again, has some amount of social media platform functionality, but it's not naturally a social media platform. You don't think of Telegram, you think of it as a point-to-point text platform. And so it's designed a little bit differently. And its leadership structure, or its company structure, is different than a lot of the large online platforms, or what the EU would refer to as VLOPs at this point, very large online platforms. Its user base is rapidly growing, and so it's becoming more prominent, especially in places around the world. But it doesn't bear as much scrutiny as Facebook, Twitter, or X, TikTok to an extent, because of the user base being more global. Because the headquarters is not based in the U.S. and because it doesn't invest in things like platform governance. It's a very, very kind of slimly staffed or less staffed platform by design. Now, the founder of Telegram was also the founder of VKontakte, is a Russian national. When the oligarchical system in Russia forced Pavel Durov, the founder of Telegram, to sell his stake in VKontakte, it was bought by Gazprom. Durov is known as the Mark Zuckerberg of Russia. That doesn't necessarily mean that he's very popular with the Kremlin, but he's kind of this non-state figure that has avoided state scrutiny wherever possible by design. And that's kind of the reputation for Telegram. And so unless there is explicitly illegal or egregious content, things like terrorist recruitment online, which it was known for a period of time, they don't take a huge amount of content moderation action on that platform. It's very, like I said, it's very laissez-faire. And so that's part of the reason why you haven't seen Telegram take as much action. It's part of their culture. It's part of the design of their platform. It's part of who they are as a platform. And it's rapidly growing. So I think it'll become more prominent in the conversation about what to do about social media platforms or digital platforms. But it's kind of, as you say, flown under the radar for the last few years because of this reason.
You brought up TikTok, and I wanted to ask, because it seems to be part of so many kind of controversies and societal debates in recent months. For instance, we have European Parliament elections coming up, and in many European countries, including in this one, we've seen that some politicians or political candidates are very active at using TikTok and have acquired a huge number of followers, while others have taken this more hawkish stance that no, we need to be aware of the security risks, and that it would be hypocritical for me to warn about the security risks but then use the platform myself to gain popularity. Where do you side on this? Should politicians be allowed to have TikTok accounts?
So I would point out that in the United States, both presidential candidates at this point are active on TikTok. And both have been very hawkish in their verbiage about the security threat posed by ByteDance, the owner of TikTok's platform. So it's a fascinating debate. The DFRLab just wrote a very long technical analysis based on the policy conversation that we're having in the United States. And in the United States right now, where the conversation is at is fascinating. Both houses, or both bodies of our legislature, of our Congress, have passed a bill that forces the divestiture, not the ban, importantly, but forces the divestiture of ByteDance's ownership of TikTok. And President Biden signed that bill. And so at this point in the United States, TikTok has to divest from ByteDance ownership. So that's where our conversation is at in the United States on banning, not just usage, but potential divestiture, potential shifting ownership structure of TikTok in order to ensure that the company that operates TikTok is not based in China and thus subject to the Chinese Communist Party's national security law, meaning the CCP could make a request of ByteDance with regard to TikTok, and TikTok would be forced to oblige under Chinese law.
Or that it would have its representatives on its boards and things like that.
Absolutely. And so we wanted to perform a technical analysis based on the fact that the conversation about TikTok is so politically driven and has hit a fever pitch on whether TikTok is this actual threat. And so we wanted to do technical research about what that threat actually means. And what we did was we looked at the articulated threats. And then we did a technical analysis of whether TikTok was unique across other social media platforms. Now, the first articulated threat is that TikTok is obliged to follow national security law in China. And that's real. If the CCP made a request of ByteDance, then ByteDance would be forced to comply. And those requests could, as you say, be anything from board membership to direct requests for changing the operations of TikTok or changing what is surfacing on TikTok potentially, or getting data out of TikTok. Now, that's a real threat. That's a real potential threat. I'm not Pollyannish so much that, or I'm not naive enough to think that they aren't using that law to request information from TikTok. Now, if you look at the other articulated threats, and I'll use the U.S. ecosystem as the main example here, the second articulated threat is that the CCP can use TikTok to gather as much data about users, whether that's users in the United States or users in Europe, as they would like. And then they can analyze that data and better tailor information operations or use that data in other malicious ways, because we generate a lot of data. You could figure out what all of our preferences are if we were on TikTok. And so that is a real threat. That said, at least in the United States right now, this is not true in Europe, where you have the GDPR. In the United States, we don't have a federal data privacy standard. And so if you banned TikTok today, then CCP could still buy all of that data legally on the open market via data brokers. So all of the data that is captured on social media platforms and in other places across the web is packaged into consumer information that you can buy. And a lot of companies do buy them. It's how companies tailor ads so that when you're scrolling on social media and you are thinking in your mind, oh man, I could really use this type of product, the next thing you see on your social media feed is that exact product. And you say, oh my gosh, is somebody spying on me? So even if you banned TikTok in the United States, at this point, CCP would still have data access because they could buy it on the open market. That's number one. The second perceived threat is whether or not the CCP, China, is uniquely using TikTok to tamper with algorithms, meaning what is surfaced on the platform or taken off of the platform is tampered with by China. And there have been instances where we've seen certain narratives get more shift, but it's
teenagers suddenly supporting Osama bin Laden's letter.
Right. That's a somewhat comical example that ended up in parody. But for instance, during social justice protests in the United States, a lot of the narratives around the world were that the United States is a uniquely violent place, et cetera. And so those narratives, if China is tipping its fingers on the scale, then you have a real vulnerability. That said, it's not proven yet that China is uniquely tampering with the algorithms on TikTok. And so if you ban TikTok, then it might not actually address that challenge. What would help solve that challenge systemically, not just on TikTok, but across other social media platforms, is making sure that technical researchers that don't work for companies have access to look at what's happening within algorithms. So that researcher access debate is the holistic approach to the perceived threat on algorithmic tampering on TikTok. And then the third unique threat is whether the CCP is using TikTok in a unique or singular way for information operations. And the DFRLab has done a lot of research on this. We have uncovered Chinese information operations on a lot of different platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, etc. And we've done analysis of what China's strategy, in their own words, is. It's called discourse power. The way that they connect their industrial policy to their tech platform governance policy to the way that they engage on those platforms in things like state media or information operations. And in their own words, they basically say that it would be problematic to invest all of their information operations strategy in one platform because not everybody uses just one platform. And so they have an approach for information operations that incorporates engaging with people in a bunch of different places. And so banning TikTok doesn't necessarily address the unique challenge that is Chinese information operations. And this comes to a values conversation about open societies. Our core national security and national interest in democracies is to have an open information environment. We don't ban things, generally speaking, right? And if TikTok, which does have a number of threats and unique state threats that are involved in the platform or on the platform, is banned, then what does that say about us as a society? And so figuring out what that holistic approach to create resilience, or making sure that if we move to ban something, that the evidence is so overwhelming that it is being uniquely used, we need to have that case before we move towards ban. Because the day that after a ban, I can guarantee you that Chinese information operations around the world will be focused on whataboutism that says, well, we want to have a sovereign information environment and control over our information environment because that's our value set in our system as China, as a authoritarian
Well, China's already
system.
doing this, right? Yeah.
Behind their great firewall. And that's not the case for open societies. So we absolutely have to have a plan for what that means so that China doesn't show up in global middle ground countries and say, see what I told you? They're just like us. Because we aren't.
Maybe one final topic I wanted to ask you about concerns elections. Many speakers today have said that this is the kind of historic year of elections. Of course, elections in the U.S., UK, EU, plenty of other countries. From your perspective, what can we expect in terms of foreign election interference this year?
It depends on what country you're in with regard to foreign election interference. And our team is currently building up an agenda to make sure that we are looking at as many countries as humanly possible in as transparent a way as humanly possible. This year, over half the world's population is going to the polls, 4.2 billion people, according to The Economist. That is factually the largest global election year on history. It's also the largest global election year until at least 2048. And so in a generation, this is the largest election year. And elections with regard to I.O. or information operations have always been this kind of focal point. Because it's a prime target. If you're a state threat actor that wants to influence a country, then elections are the time that you can kind of plan for on a calendar. And you know that it's a unique opportunity when that society is coming together, consuming information and making decisions about its future. And so that's why there's so much energy in the, for instance, counter-disinfo community on focusing on elections, or the countering information operations community on focusing on elections. What to expect this year? We live in a globalized information environment, for better or for worse. The information environment is uniquely global, even if we engage hyperlocally with our friends and family wherever we are. And what that means is that to some extent, it's natural that countries will have a view on what happens in other countries because it affects them. That said, malicious information operations or influence operations targeting elections that are covert, that are malign, that are coercive in nature, that's out of bounds in an open information environment or in a functioning democracy. What we can expect this year, if you look at elections, not all of the people that are going to the polls are in fully functioning democracies. As an example, Russia had elections this year, and in no shape or form...
I don't know. I would call them elections.
Right. They're not elections, but they are included in that 4.2 billion people going to the polls number. And I completely agree with you. This is my point, is that that's not a democracy, and yet there are Potemkin polls or Potemkin elections. And so you have to understand that information operations in each one of these countries, whether that's an EU member state or India, which went to the polls in the last few days. The UK goes to the poll on July 4th. which as an American I think is somewhat funny. And of course, the United States goes to the polls in November. What we expect from foreign actors is consistent information operations, and I'm talking specifically about Russia. We expect them to continue on with information operations similar to the information operations that we've seen before. China, we're seeing them be more assertive, slightly different from Russia in their tactics and strategy and approach, but we're seeing a more assertive approach from China. And interestingly, in the wake of the October 7 attack from Hamas against Israel and the conflict between in Gaza, we're seeing more malign information operations matched with malign cyber activity from Iran specifically. And so I would expect that to uptick. So we're looking at a world where there's a number of malicious state actors who are actively trying to engage and interfere or influence elections. And at this point in a globalized information environment, as we've talked about 2 years ago, we have to expect them. It's a little like needing to drink water or needing to breathe air. It's a natural occurrence at this point, and we've got to be on alert. And my biggest concern on this is that the topic of misinformation, the topic of disinformation, which I think is distinct from malign influence operations. Malign influence operations can include misinformation or disinformation specifically, but that topic of information integrity in building resilience in societies, especially democratic societies, is a political hot potato at this point, which makes it really, really difficult to defend ourselves or build up resilience towards state actors who are trying to actively influence the outcomes in our countries. And so we've got to really, really shore up our defense there and be confidently engaged in identifying state threat actor activity in this global election year. Otherwise, regardless of what we do, the world is going to look a lot different when we get together in the next year. And a part of that, a better outcome will be if we have our defenses up for democracies around the world and for the thing that makes democracy function, which is a clear, coherent, secure, open information environment that allows people to come together and make collective decisions.
On that note, Graham, thank you so much for sharing your insight.
Thank you so much for having me.